Yeah. I mean, they were meant. Poetry generally was created to be read in a salon. You know, somebody would, the poet himself perhaps, would stand up in front of the ladies and mostly ladies, and read the sonnets,
Okay, gotcha.
and read the poems,
Yeah,
But
because it's always been more of a private affair as opposed to plays
yeah,
which are more public
yeah.
and out in the open. Okay.
But there was, I mean, having said that, there was the poems and the sonnets were printed very much earlier than the plays. In fact, there was a great reluctance to print the plays. Oh, yes, you talked about the folio, which brings me.
Yes. Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up.
Which brings me to the folio. Shakespeare died in 1616. The folio was printed in 1623. When Shakespeare died, only about 18 of the plays had actually been printed. Some of them in copies, which were some of the in quarto versions. Quarto would be like a paperback. A folio is a huge book, sort of like a modern encyclopedia,
Right.
and in terms of size. And only, I think, 18 of the plays had been printed in quarto version, and some of the quarto versions were not official and were, I mean, we still have them, and were almost certainly pirated, in that. A hired man, perhaps, who had played one or two of the characters, went to a printer and said, "Look, I mean, that play, Timon of Athens, which everybody is loving. I can get you a printed. We can print a version of it and sell it on the book stands in St. Paul's churchyard, and we could make a lot of money." And so the resultant quarto was somewhat bastardized version of the play, because he was working from his memory of what had gone on stage.
So he didn't actually. So they didn't actually have like the lines or anything in front of them. They were just going off memory.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's what we can pretty much surmise now from some of the quartos. Some of the quartos were official. I mean, there's the famous. There are two different quartos of Hamlet. There's the first quarto and the second quarto, and so there are actually three versions of Hamlet. There's the first quarto, which is a bastardized version. There's the second quarto, which was supervised and overseen by the Chamberlain's men, or the King's men, actually, I think, by that time. And then there's the folio version. They're all three really quite different. Some of the scenes are in different order, and what you get in any edited version, edited by an academic, and I'll get to the academics in a minute, is usually an amalgam of all three versions. And so the whole thing, if you do the whole thing as printed in any edited version, it lasts about 5 hours, and there is no way that any play given the terms and conditions and working practices of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre, there's no way a play could have lasted 5 hours. So my personal feeling is that the first quarto was, yes, some scholars have isolated, which characters and there were probably two, which characters the two players played. Marcellus, I can't remember the others. Any research will show that up. The second quarter was authorized, and the folio version is different again from the second quarter. Given the time scale, I think there were quite obviously possibly rewrites. I mean, if you've ever, I mean, every film screenwriter will say, they get to draft 75 before they even get to one that is workable.
Right.
So I don't think the idea of rewriting was unknown in that period.
I mean that does make sense. So my other question is, because I'm someone who enjoys reading Shakespeare. I've made it a point to try to collect as many Shakespeare plays from a certain publisher as I could. How do I know, for example, that the Oxford World Classics edition of Henry IV Part 1 is genuine, and it's not based on the other quartos that may or may not have characters that aren't supposed to be in there, or lines that aren't supposed to be in there?
Right. What scholars do to Shakespeare. Interesting that you should bring that up, because I'm talking to a scholar at the moment, and we're talking about setting up an online debate, how the scholar and how the player approaches Shakespeare. What are their differences? Where do they overlap? And how can they complement each other rather than be at odds with each other? Because to answer your question, if it's any respected academic print house, Cambridge or Oxford, then you could be fairly sure, except that because scholars don't understand a lot of the choices in the way the verse is laid out, they make what I personally consider to be incorrect choices, incorrect assumptions and choices, particularly in lineage, the way it's lined. And I found some glaring well, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio has this long speech. Then I see Queen Mab hath been with you, with thee. She is the fairest midwife. She comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone. And now I have a copy of a facsimile, not a copy, of the First Folio. And in every edited version I found, it's been versified. Whereas in the folio, it's in prose. Up until about 2 or 3 lines before Romeo interjects, and then it switches into verse. Now, as a player, I understand. And having, because I always do it. I mean, it's just, it's all very well to think about it and to talk about it, but you have to do it. And I always do it. And in fact, that Mercutio speech is wonderful because when there is a complete shift when he goes into verse. Hello? Yeah.
Oh no, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah, yeah. And so why have every scholar who has prepared an edited version of Romeo and Juliet gone through the effort, because it's not easy. You have to reline it. If you look at it in the folio, I mean, to take the speech as it's laid out in the folio, and look at it and compare it to the way it's laid out in every edited version. I mean, there's an awful lot of work that's gone in to versifying it. And it's very it's very frustrating as a performer, because versified, it's actually extremely difficult to play. Whereas if you do it in prose, it flows. It's incredibly poetic. It's incredibly full. It's full of the most amazing imagery, but it's not in verse.
So basically, so it sounds like what the scholars are doing is they're just taking something that's not supposed to be in verse and try to make it fit into that mold because they feel that's how Shakespeare would have wanted it. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, yes, I'm not going to go into the assumptions of what goes on in the minds of scholars, because and that's why we are talking. John and I are talking about putting this debate together, because very often we're at odds, us the players and the scholars, because our approach is so different.
Right, right.
Yeah. I mean, if you take it down to its absolute very basic, the scholar will say, "What does it mean?" And the player will say, "How does it feel?"
Yeah, because because obviously, from a scholarly point of view, they're not. I mean, at least that I know, they're not going to step out onto the stage and perform it the way that an actor would. So they're
Mhm.
comfortable. They're comfortable approaching it from an intellectual standpoint, trying to understand the history, the psychology. Whereas an actor is going to feel for the flow of those lines.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to ask you about your about your show Shakespeare Unbound. What do you? It's gonna sound like a dumb question, but what do you cover on your show? Do you cover the do you I'm assuming you go into Shakespeare quite a lot, but do you cover your analysis of those lines in detail very very well, or Colin, are you there? It appears Colin has dropped off. Let me see if I can get him back on here. Um, I guess while we're waiting for Colin to come back, I did want to say that this approach to Shakespeare from a performer standpoint, actually does make sense because the Shakespearean plays have always been meant to be performed, and I think where we kind of, at least in my perspective, where we've sort of fallen off is the fact that we've reduced it to a literary intellectual exercise, and in a way, it's sort of the easier route, but it also does Shakespeare a huge disservice because we lose the flow, we lose the meaning, we lose the emphasis that that Shakespeare puts in his lines. So just as Colin said earlier about that famous speech from Hamlet, "To be or not to be," when we read it, it kind of goes over our heads because we're thinking about what's going on in Hamlet's mind. Is he contemplating something serious? Is he doing this or is he doing that? But from a performer standpoint, as you said before, there's a bit of a story to it because if you're saying that is the question, it sort of creates this realization that maybe this thing that's been rattling my head, maybe there's something to it. Um, that's my takeaway from this entire from that approach to understanding those lines, and it's a very fascinating approach, I think. Um, let's see if we can get Colin back on here. I sent the invite back. Let me see if I can get him back. But we'll see. We'll see what we can do to get Colin back on the podcast. But while we're doing that, let me know down in the comments what you think of Shakespeare. Let me know if there are certain approaches that you feel work for you when trying to understand the bard and his work. And also remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think. I would definitely love to get more guests onto the show, and definitely love to grow the podcast as well as the audience base for the channel. I'm gonna include links for Colin's channel. Let's see if I can find any links for his show, as well as anything in terms of his social media profile or sites. I will put that down the link as well because this is a very fascinating topic for me, and it's something that I would definitely love to expand upon on the podcast in future episodes. And I guess the big question for me is which I guess which publisher gets Shakespeare correct the most because over the years I've tried collecting different publishers just to see if there's a bit of a difference. I did mention the Oxford World Classics. I've got Hamlet and Henry the Fourth Part One, and Pelican Shakespeare. At least in my younger days, it was sort of a go-to for me. But I've started looking at other publishers like Arden. I believe RSC has several copies out as well. I think I've got the RSC copy of Richard the Third, and then I've got the Arden copy of Richard the Second. So that would so hopefully that'll be a future episode where I can ask Colin if there is if there's a particular publisher that he would recommend. I will say I've never been a fan of the Folger library versions of Shakespeare. If you went to school in the late '90s, early 2000s, I know the Folger copy was the copy that every student had to get when they were reading Shakespeare. I know I had to get it for Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet. There was one other one. I think it might have been Midsummer Night's Dream. Although I cheated a little bit and I got the Signet Classic version instead. But all the lines seem to be there. So we'll just wait to see if we can get Colin back on here, and if not, we'll go ahead and end the episode. But like I said, I mean, from this is a huge shift for the podcast, because previously we've always, like I said before, we've always done movie reviews, trailer reactions, give our opinions on certain topics, certain movies, as well as interview filmmakers and producers and film festival organizers. So I feel like by doing this particular episode, it kind of opens up the doors to include different perspectives, not only on on the arts, but also different segments within the performing community. Just because Shakespeare has always been such a huge influence on on the public imagination. I know in the UK, Shakespeare has a much stronger presence because of the fact that the bard is English, but it's also had a huge influence on the way that people around the world have always understood and appreciated Shakespeare. In terms of what he says, how he conveys our hopes, fears, and understanding of the human condition.